On February 24th of 2026, a man approached a security checkpoint in Punjab, Pakistan. He was wearing an explosive vest. Moments later, he set off the charge. 2 people were killed with an additional 5 injured. But this begs the question, why suicide bombing? This is the age of drones. Sure, in a morbid way, suicide bombing has been one of the most effective ways to blow something up. Before drones, AI, and modern technology, if you had a target, especially a dynamic target with a brain and incentives not to blow up, putting explosives on yourself and running into that target was a pretty reliable way to deliver a payload, as you essentially turned yourself into a human-guided smart bomb. But this is 2026. For a few $100, you can buy yourself a commercial drone and strap a warhead onto it. Or better yet, you can construct your own homemade drone, and while perhaps a little more crude, you can also guide it into a target. So if there is already technology that can deliver payloads without killing the attacker, why in the world would anyone still use a human being? Why suicide bombing? And the answer comes down to 3 main reasons that have already appeared throughout history: practicality, desperation, and psychology. But before I continue, I absolutely need to make a few disclaimers. This video is purely educational. Do not blow yourselves up. I will be discussing suicide bombing strictly in the context of warfare between combatants, not attacks targeting civilians or civilian infrastructure. The scenario in the beginning I do consider to be in a combat context, as the targets were armed security personnel during the outbreak of a series of skirmishes. And due to YouTube's moderation policies, I may occasionally use terms like human bomber or self-bomber instead of repeating the word suicide 100,000 times. With that being said, we first need to define what a suicide bomber even is. At first glance, the definition seems obvious. A suicide bomber is someone who blows themselves up to kill others. But once you start looking at history, things get a little more complicated. Take the story of Private Karl Klinke, a Prussian engineer during the Second Schleswig War. I'm sorry if I butcher that. During the Battle of Diebel, Klinke ran towards a Danish fortification carrying demolition charges. He placed the charges against the palisade wall and then he detonated it, destroying the defenses and also killing himself in the process. This breach allowed the Prussian forces to storm the position. So, was he a suicide bomber? Well, according to the Merriam-Webster dictionary, a suicide bomber is, and I quote, a person who ends or plans to end their own life by exploding a bomb in order to kill other people. But that definition creates problems. Klinke was targeting enemy fortifications, not necessarily people. So does that mean he wasn't a suicide bomber? Or imagine a different scenario. A soldier throws a grenade, but it slips from their hand and it lands at their feet. Enemies jump into the trench and then everyone explodes. So was that soldier a suicide bomber? According to the Merriam-Webster dictionary, he was, because intent doesn't matter. As I'm sure you can see by now, all of this can get pretty confusing, and so for the sake of this video, I will define a suicide bomber as someone who intentionally sacrifices their life using a destructive device in order to achieve a military objective. And this can be divided into 2 categories: pre-planned and circumstantial. Pre-planned is exactly as it sounds and probably the one most people think of when it comes to human bombing. These are individuals or units specifically designed to carry out suicidal missions, whether it be kamikazes or the Chinese unafraid to die units, also sometimes referred to as dare to die units. Circumstantial attacks are different. These are individuals who did not begin the fight intending to sacrifice themselves, but the circumstances pushed them towards that decision. A famous example comes from the Battle of Stalingrad. A Red Army soldier named Mikhail Paninka was about to throw a Molotov cocktail when it was struck by a bullet which then engulfed him in flames. While burning alive, he would climb out of his trench and run towards a German tank, where he smashed his remaining Molotov cocktail onto the engine deck and then threw his burning body onto the vehicle. This set the enemy tank on fire and repelled the German assault. While Mikhail at the start of the engagement had no intention of directly using his life to eliminate the enemy, in that moment, while on fire, he chose to use his final minutes to destroy the enemy. That is why I would consider it to be a circumstantial suicide attack. And so once we understand those categories, we can start asking the real questions. Why do people resort to this tactic at all? Starting with the physical advantages of suicide bombing. As disturbing as it sounds, a human bomber is essentially a low-cost smart bomb. A human being can adapt to changing situations, navigate complex terrain, disguise themselves, and adjust their plan in real time. A person can approach a checkpoint with less less suspicion than a drone flying overhead. Explosives can be hidden underneath clothing. Targets can be chosen at the very last second. In short, the human brain becomes the guidance system. There is another advantage as well. If someone is prepared to die during the attack, their tactical options change drastically. Imagine two soldiers attempting to destroy an enemy tank. The first soldier wants to survive, and so they must think about both the approach and the escape. The second soldier has no intention of returning, and that removes half the problem. The distances they are willing to close becomes much greater as the risk they are willing to take also becomes much greater. Of course, real combat is far more complicated than a simple example like this, but the basic principles still apply. But I hear some of you may be saying, sure, the tactical advantages of being a suicide bomber are apparent. No one's denying that, but you haven't addressed the elephant in the room, which is that being a suicide bomber costs a human life. Especially in a war of attrition, surely there are more reasons to not use a suicide bomber than to use one. And that is a good question if you ask. The tactical advantages alone does not explain why self-bombing appears so much more often in history. One of the more common reasons is far simpler: desperation. And so let's talk about the circumstances of becoming a human bomb, starting with pre-planned aka dedicated self-bombers. While no group or culture invented the idea of human bombing, one of the first modern examples of a dedicated quote-unquote suicide unit in war would be the Chinese 敢死队. You often hear it as dare to die units, however a more accurate translation would be a willing or unafraid to die units. And as the name implies, these units would be used as shock troops sent on missions almost certain to result in their deaths. This includes strapping grenades onto their bodies to throw themselves underneath enemy tanks or into enemy positions. These units were employed out of desperation. You see, oftentimes in mainstream media, when it comes to portraying all Chinese soldiers in the Second Sino-Japanese War / World War II, you often see them portrayed as something like this: Stahlhelm wearing, shiny new uniforms, brandishing modern rifles and machine guns. However, this is extremely misleading, as units equipped with something like this were the elite units, such as the elite 88th Division who fought in the Battle of Shanghai. It is not wrong to say that Chinese soldiers look like this. It is wrong to say that the average Chinese soldier looked like this. It's sort of like if I was talking about the French soldier in the Napoleonic Wars and I showed a picture of the Old Guard, the French elite. Were they technically soldiers of France? Yes, but it would be widely misleading to represent the average French soldier as the Old Guard. In fact, there were Chinese teams, usually sent on night raids, armed with daos, aka broadswords, due to the shortage of arms and ammunition, with many regular units wearing straw sandals and having a hodgepodge of men armed with rifles and swords due to, again, the shortage of arms and ammunition. And with the lack of equipment and weaponry also came the lack of anti-tank weapons. So, what happens when an enemy tank appears? What do you do when armored vehicles are rolling towards your position and you have nothing capable of stopping them? You give volunteers explosives so that they can throw themselves underneath enemy tanks so that they can hide in a ditch and wait for a tank to roll over before setting off their charge, so on and so forth. As morbid as it is, what was the alternative? Ask the Japanese tanks for a quick time out? Of course not. This was not something done out of stupidity, and this is really what I want to emphasize with this video. Let me give you a famous example from the Battle of Shanghai during the fight for the Sihang warehouse. Before I get into the story, this self-bombing account you're about to hear is sometimes debated on whether or not it actually happened. However, this account was recorded in a recollection of veteran memories by Li Cunling in recalling the isolated soldiers of Sihang in Shanghai, and also argued as plausible by historian and author Stephen Robinson, who wrote this book. And it's not like this instance of self-bombing was the only record of human bombings during the Second Sino-Japanese War. The aforementioned Dare to Die units were well documented, as well as other individual acts of human bombing. So while this story is dramatic, it's not really that much of a stretch compared to the other stuff you read about during this war. And so with that being said, along with the fact that this story is probably one of the most famous ones, I will go through with giving this example. As the Japanese soldiers approached the base of the warehouse, they covered themselves with steel plates and suppressing fire while they began to set demolition charges at the base of the walls. Due to the heavy metal plates shielding the attackers from shrapnel and the steep angle of approach preventing easy shots paired with suppression, 21-year-old Chen Susen, seeing this, leapt from the 5th floor of the warehouse and used the weight of his body to crash through the shields while holding onto a grenade bundle. Chen and the Japanese attackers would all perish, and the Japanese assault was stopped. When hearing this story, some may ask, well, why didn't he just, I don't know, strap grenades to sandbags and use the weight of those to crash through the shields? Or why didn't he just cook the grenades and toss them at the Japanese down below so that they didn't have time to deflect them with their shields or toss them away? Or why didn't he try anything else before strapping grenades onto his body and blow himself up? I mean, surely there was something else he could have done, right? And these are reasonable questions. I mean, using your body as a human bomb is quite literally a last and permanent decision. And while this is one specific example, there are many throughout history who have also taken such desperate measures. It is easy for myself and many others to judge the actions of these individuals when they resort to such desperate measures. But these decisions are made through the fog of war. By the time Sun strapped his body with grenades and began his final journey, the Japanese were in the midst of setting demolition charges. This isn't Call of Duty. There's no timer or bar taken down saying, you have 30 seconds to stop the enemy before the walls are breached. Sun and the defenders, as far as they knew, the Japanese could have been 10 seconds away from lighting the charges or 5 minutes. And so could Sun have found sandbags or some heavy objects to strap grenades onto and use as a weight? Potentially. But again, Sun nor any of the defenders had any idea how much time there was left before the charges were set off. And so spending additional time improvising explosives could have very well sealed the fate of the defenders. As for cooking grenades, that is not advised presently and historically, as grenade fuses are not all exactly the same, even with the same models, and in the heat of combat with adrenaline and chaos, you can easily have a warped perception of time and end up blowing yourself up and everyone else around you. But the key part of me talking about this, and one of the main reasons I wanted to make this video, is that people who resort to human bombing are not just idiots. There is a reason why they have been used throughout human history, throughout various cultures, and it's not because the people doing so are too stupid to figure out any other way to take out the enemy. If a Japanese tank is lighting your friends up, you're not gonna say, hey, Mr. Tank, that's not very kind of you. We don't have sufficient anti-tank weaponry, and so please dismount and give us a fair fight. It is easy, myself included, to armchair general. It is easy to criticize and say that they should have done this or they should have done that, but the reality is that what people face in actual combat scenarios at that very moment is theirs alone to judge. And so when someone resorts to such tactics, do not simply just dismiss them as idiotic. It is more often than not a decision made due to desperation and the circumstances of combat. But while I have explained the physical advantages of self-bombing from a tactical point of view, it still doesn't explain why modern alternatives weren't used for this encounter, especially since this individual wasn't out of options like my previous examples. And so this leads to the final reason: psychological. Yes, facing an enemy without regards for his or her own life is terrifying, but the psychological impact is not only directed at the enemy, it also affects the attacker's own side. When someone sacrifices themselves in war, they do not simply disappear from the battlefield. They become a symbol, a martyr. Their story spreads. Their sacrifice becomes a rallying point. In Chinese culture, acts of extreme bravery like this are referred to as earning first-class merit. The idea of martyrdom is not exclusive to just one culture, although because I am more familiar with Chinese culture and the Second Sino-Japanese War, I will provide an analysis from that perspective, but again, the things I say can also equally apply to other groups. When it comes to warfare and battlefield success, what is often the main focus is weaponry, economics, population, etc., etc. Those things are important, do not misunderstand me, but it is morale that creates the foundation of success on the battlefield and in war. Now, there are obviously limits to this. One side having high morale won't make them immune to bullets, nor will high morale cause swords and spears to become tactical nukes. What I mean by morale is the willingness for a population to fight and sustain that fight. When someone does an act as drastic as becoming a human bomb, it gives their side something to rally around. It gives them a legend. Legends that inspire others to keep on fighting, and in Chinese culture, to earn first-class merit is the highest accomplishment someone can achieve in their life. And in warfare, the victors aren't always the ones with the fanciest tanks and weaponry. They are also the ones who, despite being at a material disadvantage, maintain their morale. And what contributes to that morale are the stories of self-sacrifice. So, why are suicide bombers used in war? It's not because people are just plain stupid. It's not because people are incapable of finding any other methods. It is because this tactic combines three core factors. Practicality. A human bomb is a low-cost guided weapon. Desperation. Sometimes soldiers face enemies with no effective alternatives. And psychology. In modern warfare, drones may replace many weapons, but they cannot replace the impact of a martyr. And that is why, even in the age of drones, whether you like it or not, suicide bombers still appear on the battlefield. And finally, I know I already made this disclaimer at the beginning, I am not advising anyone to blow themselves up. This is for educational purposes only. If you're interested in more military history and analysis like this, I actually incorporate short history segments into many of my gaming videos as well. So if that sounds strange but interesting, feel free to check them out. And I also have a playlist dedicated to more military analysis stuff.